Cool. So that's all the like housekeeping stuff. So I'm going to just introduce a little bit about what the event's about and make some kind of thanks and stuff. So obviously we're talking today about role-playing games and environments. I'll say a bit more about what I mean by the word environments in a mo. But I should first of all shout out to Gaming Lab, who are a part of Asmodee Research, who've really kindly supported this event, and it's part of a global cycle of events investigating role-playing games and role-play cultures. And they've got events happening in France, in the UK, Italy, Canada, and in the US. And I know some people in the audience are involved in the US event as well. So if they want to post about that in the chat, then feel free to do so. So we're all about kind of sharing knowledge and sharing experiences between the scientific community, the academic community, but also between game designers and game players as well, and recognizing that those things aren't always separate. So we're really grateful to Gaming Lab for giving us a sort of vehicle through which to do this work. And also to our own Centre for Creative Writing and English Literature for giving us a bit of cash to put together some materials for this event, including an amazing folk horror RPG podcast that was written and GM'd by Howard David Ingham, who's one of our panelists today, and role played by members of the network. We've got that up available to download and listen to now on our website. So if you kind of want to get a taste of some of the stuff we're talking about, and in particular Howard's role-playing game, The Shivering Circle, and you should check that out on our website as well. And one other plug while I'm kind of still doing announcements and stuff, this is one of two events that we're running with Asmodee, and the second one is on Monday next week, and that's all about role-playing in history. And it's actually an event that investigates the use of Dungeons and Dragons to engage with the history of the early Islamic world. And it's a mod really that this role-play group have kind of made to role-play kind of authentic a moment of history. And again, there'll be a podcast for that, and there'll be a panel discussion on Monday the 10th of May, and it's free and you can sign up through Eventbrite, so check it out if you're interested in that. So the next set of people to thank is our panel, and for their time this evening and for coming along to share their thoughts and their expertise on role-playing games. We've got Paul Baldowski, the creator of the award-winning rules-light horror system Cthulhu Hack, which is a Lovecraftian-based mythos-stripping game with stripped-down mechanics that's an homage to the early Dungeons and Dragons. The hack system takes early D&D and strips it down to the framework and rebuilds it into something very innovative. And as well as producing the core rules for that game, Paul has produced numerous adventures and source books. But his latest project is a little bit different. It's a project called The D Sanction, and that's a standalone tabletop role-playing game about traitors seeking absolution through investigation and magic in the age of Dr. John Dee, an Elizabethan role-playing game, which is like totally awesome. We've got Howard David Ingham, who's a writer, editor, and film critic. He's the author of We Don't Go Back, A Watcher's Guide to Folk Horror Film, that was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. He's also got a wealth of experience in writing for tabletop role-playing games, and most recently, these have been for Green Ronin, including Modern Age and Threefold, but it's also included work on the Call of Cthulhu system. Howard's also written and published I think it's the first folk horror RPG. There are now imitators. There are now people vying for a piece of the folk horror pie, but the Shivering Circle, I think, was the first one. And this has got its own innovative system, again, favouring storytelling over mechanics. And I think folk horror RPGs are maybe going to be the next new popular thing, the new thing. So Shivering Circle is definitely ahead of the curve. Now, Howard's interest in folk horror have also led him to work on the Rural Gothic project, which is, again, a kind of academic and creative space, kind of crossover space, and the Folklore podcast. We've got Kathryn Jenkins with us today as well. She's an RPG writer who's written for settings for Cthulhu Hack and also written on Cthulhu Dark. Now, this latter system is a rules-light take on Lovecraftian horror. And again, it's a system that's very much about collaborative storytelling, favouring collaborative storytelling over mechanics. And it's really interesting to have Kathryn here today to talk a little bit about that, because there's a nice lineage from Cthulhu Dark to the trophy system that Jessie has written. So I'd like, getting those two in conversation is going to be really interesting. We've got Dr. Nick Mizer here as well. He's an academic, and his work primarily focuses on tabletop role-playing games. Can't speak tonight. But it also includes other analog, digital and mixed media forms of play. His monograph titled Tabletop Role-Playing Games and the Experience of Imagined Worlds was published in 2019, and he's published numerous other scholarly papers on role-playing games, and he's contributed to the collection on role-playing game studies as well. In fact, I had slides for all of you. I'm going to just really quickly, this is Paul's slide. There we go. That's all Paul's stuff. There are Howard's books there. I totally forgot about my slides. That's what happens when you're stressed. And then we've got Kathryn's work on Cthulhu Dark and Cthulhu Hack. And then here we go. This is next slide. And then last but not least, only last because it's alphabetical order, we've got Jessie, who's creator of the trophy role-playing game, and that's been developed through Jessie's work in the Gauntlet RPG community, and it's soon to be officially published after a successful Kickstarter. So Trophy is a tabletop role-playing game about a group of treasure hunters entering a forest that doesn't want them there. So it's perfect for tonight's discussion. And Trophy's actually two games. It's Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold. Trophy Dark's a one-shot game of psychological horror, and Trophy Gold's a campaign adventure, more in the old school style, but both are rooted in a strong sense of the environment. And Jessie is the owner of Hedgemaze Press. And I'm your host tonight. I'm Dr. Chloé Germaine, and I work on analog games and role-playing games and board games. I'm actually, I started out my research in Gothic studies, in Gothic literature, so super into the horror and the Gothic side of gaming. So I'll be sort of hosting and chatting to the panelists tonight. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up about our structure, as the introductions have suggested, tonight we're really interested in exploring role-playing games that use creepy, eerie, weird, Gothic, and those kinds of settings in their world building. And we are most interested tonight in the indie scene, where players and creators are developing role-play in really innovative directions. And the games all featured tonight all favour very kind of rules-like mechanics and a particular emphasis on storytelling and atmosphere in which players shape the world of the story as they go. And these are games in which environments themselves become something more than just the setting, but become kind of central actors in the story. So we're going to have a kind of Q&A interviews portion of the evening, where I'll be asking each of the panelists to talk a little bit more about their games, their work, and their role-play philosophies. And then we're going to move to a moderated panel discussion, where we'll kind of look at some of these questions on the role of the environment and the setting in role-playing games, and hopefully we'll find out some synergies between our panelists and their work. And I should say, when I'm talking about the environment, I don't just mean like the natural world, of course. I mean anything that goes into the world building and the feeling of being in another world when you're playing a role-playing game. So there's loads to chat about. And then we will be moving on to a Q&A where the audience can ask questions. Now you can post those questions at the end during that Q&A, and we'll pick them up through the chat, or you can post them as we go. And as I say, Paul will be picking those up and passing them on to me. So your questions can be directed at individuals on the panel about their work or about particular games, or you can pick up on questions that are kind of tapping into our broader discussion. And we're really interested to hear what players do with games, to hear about play cultures and players' approach to world building. So do feel free to share any comments with us as well as questions, because that'll be really interesting to hear from you, particularly if you've played any of the games that we're chatting about tonight. I am going to stop sharing my screen now, and then that will hopefully mean that you can see who's speaking. So just give me a mo. Fab, awesome. All right, so I'm going to go, in terms of the panelists, I'm going to go in alphabetical order, and I'm going to ask each panelist one question, some questions about their work, and then I'll move on to the next panelist. So we're going to start with Paul, because your surname begins with B. So that's how it is. Paul, can you start by telling us a little bit about your motivation for writing Cthulhu Hack and how it grew as a system?
So there's another talented game designer amongst the many here, beyond the many here, called David Black, who came up with a system called the Black Hack, which was a take on Dungeons and Dragons-esque sort of games, but simplified down to the most basic level. And he released it kind of without fanfare, but it's got a considerable following, and a lot of hacks of the hack. And one of the parts of the system called the usage die, which basically means you roll the dice, and if you get a 1 or 2, you kind of lose something, appealed to me as a potential mechanic for sanity. And bizarrely enough, it span up from there. So I wrote the Cthulhu Hack in a couple of months, released it a few months after David released his game. And I haven't looked back. From my point of view, its simplicity makes it ideal for the people who one-shot a game. And to my mind, the mythos and Cthulhu is all about the one-shot, because no one should survive. So that's the reason behind it.
Great, thank you. So coming to that the appeal of the kind of mythos and Lovecraftian horror and weird horror, what appeals in that to you as a designer and a player?
So I'm fascinated by the I'm fascinated by the one of the aspects of Lovecraft as a writer that many people pick on in his inability not to jam 57 adjectives into a sentence. But I find that color that he fills each sentence with, and the depth, fascinating. And what I wanted to do to differentiate Cthulhu Hack from all the other hundreds and hundreds of Cthulhu-driven games was to go back to Lovecraft and mine each and every sentence of his work, so that my take was an original one. And to that extent, I kind of locked away all my other Cthulhu games and didn't read any for like 5 years. I've allowed myself back in recently, but it is the way he writes and the depth in each and every word and sentence that I find fascinating. And it's fascinating to actually go into a story and come out with so many ideas.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you said that, because that's one thing that, as a scholar, when I've worked on Lovecraft in terms of like fiction and literature and film, is that it's this resource that's so open, as you say, to like being used. Like, it's got all this kind of richness and texture that people take, and they're doing something very different with it. And Cthulhu Hack does feel very different, say, to Trail of Cthulhu or Call of Cthulhu. What do you think it kind of offers, Cthulhu Hack as a system, and I suppose as a roleplay philosophy? What do you think it offers players that's quite different to, say, Call of Cthulhu or Trail of Cthulhu?
What I think Cthulhu Hack offers, and I hope has developed over the course of putting the books together in the series that I've written, is that investigators are not heroes. Investigators are pegs, cogs, bowling pins, whatever. They're there to take a stab at discovering something, but they are not essential to the overarching defeat of what is a cosmic force which defies all reasoning. Effectively, if Earth is a crumb of fairy cake in a vast, endless, infinite void, each investigator is less than a microbe on the surface of that fairy cake. So why should they matter? So what I've driven for in the game is that what each investigator discovers, what they record in their journals, what appears in newspapers, what they leave in their scattered raving notes is what's important within the game. And it means that you can take a one shot and turn it into part of a campaign without the same investigators featuring in the campaign itself. And that, I think, is key to embracing Lovecraft, where very few, if any, characters make more than one appearance.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that metaphor of the fairy cake. I have to use that with my students.
we have to thank Douglas Adams for that one somehow but yes, I think that's the key behind Lovecraft.
Anne, because I don't want to neglect this, I'd just like you to share a little bit about your new project, the D-Sanction, and the kind of the very different setting and world building that's going on there. So it's obviously a historical setting. It's also focusing on the occult. What's inspired you to write an Elizabethan role-playing game?
So that's really come from and I'm showing my age here by very precisely stating a number, about 40 years of role-playing. More or less, almost. And one of the earliest experiences I had is a game called Maelstrom, which was written by a student, like a 14-year-old student called Alexander Scott. It was a paperback, and it was Elizabethan, and the Elizabethan content was quite thin. But you knew what you were doing in it. You played ordinary people leading extraordinary lives in this environment, which was backed by this force called the Maelstrom, which allowed magic to work to a certain extent. And I think that got me into history, and that's responsible for the library that you can't quite see behind me, that I've become fascinated with that period and the notions of the occult and the way it's a sort of period in time where we're transitioning from a science and almost myth and folklore, and there's that dividing point in between. So within the game itself, it's slightly less bleak than Cthulhu Hack, in that I potentially want agents of D to survive, but the same notion is there, that you are recording things in journals and you keeping records. And effectively, D in 1563, I'm going to get my years wrong now, the Queen did actually enact an act of Parliament against the use of magic, effectively to prevent assassination or undermining of her authority through the supernatural. And in 1564, John Dee sees the potential in this, not only to defend the Queen, but also to get away with his own experiments and kind of without getting in trouble for them. So he comes up with the D-Sanction, and you are traitors who have been tried for your occult dabblings and have become agents of the Queen in defense of her expanding realm against the forces of darkness.
That sounds awesome, and I need to play that immediately. That sounds amazing. I love this idea of like a pre-enlightenment game. It's awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. And I'm going to move on to Kathryn now, because Kathryn, you've worked with Paul on Cthulhu Hack. So I guess we'll start there, and I guess you can tell us a little bit about the work you did on Cthulhu Hack and what that was, and how it's quite different to the very typical Lovecraftian gaslight sort of setting, isn't it, what you did there?
Yes. So yeah, I mean, my scenario is probably as far away from the Victorian kind of investigation or 1920s or whatever kind of typical era you tend to go for when it comes to Cthulhu. So I worked with Paul on a scenario in this book, which is awesome, which is Mother's Love, and that scenario is called Gifts of the Flesh, and it is very much a modern setting, but it harks back to ancient Greece. So there is a lot of mythology wrapped up in that particular scenario. And one of the reasons was because I studied classics when I was at university, and I've never done anything with it. So I thought, hey, I could write one that's a Cthulhu story, but, you know, with those mythological elements, which is the part that I loved studying. And with that sort of, I saw a little bit of something that I could play with that might be a bit more appealing to people who don't necessarily like that kind of typical setting. People who are like, well, I want to play this, but I don't really want to play in the 1920s. I want to play something a little bit different. I want to go for something that's a little bit more out there and a little bit more obscure. A lot of my scenarios tend to be set in weird places as opposed to where you would typically go when it comes to setting.
Yeah, and that's true actually, and it takes me on to your work on Cthulhu Dark, which I'd love you to talk about the system, like just generally, and kind of the work you did on it, but also and specifically the work you did on the setting for Arkham 1692.
Yes. So there's a lot of Arkham stuff, which is set kind of a lot more in sort of the future. From 1692. 1692 goes quite a way back, but Arkham was very much based on Salem, which was obviously where all the witch trials were going on, and 1692 was that major point when the witch trials were kind of, you know, in full force. And I was quite interested in looking at Arkham back during that time. What did Arkham look like? And you're looking at the current maps that you've got of Arkham, the ones that we tend to use, and then stripping that back to something more simple. And going back to that kind of the almost beginning history of Arkham, and really focusing on kind of the witch trials there and things like that, because the story that I wanted to focus on was, and I'm going to get the title wrong, but it's Dreams of the Witch House or Dream in the Witch's House. I can't remember the exact title. And I really wanted to focus on that story and kind of branch out from there. And Cthulhu Dark is an incredibly light system. It's very much dependent on storytelling between all of the players, not just the keeper, setting those locations and kind of getting into that setting. And what I really wanted to do was get everybody involved with Arkham and actually feel like they were tethered to it somehow. So throughout the scenario, you are tethered throughout time and space to that location. And it was really interesting to research, but it was also very difficult taking a fantastical setting, a fantasy town like Arkham, and having to kind of reinvent it backwards and still keep it so that it matched what it looks like in the majority of stories. So that was quite interesting, was almost like deconstructing it a little bit. And that was really good fun.
That's like alternative history making. You're like,
Yes.
you're like making alternative history that like tracks to Arkham now and all the many incarnations.
Yeah.
I love what you're saying about Cthulhu Dark being a really supple system, but one that is where everyone is involved in building the world and making the setting. It's not just the keeper describing, okay, you walk into this room and you see X, Y, and Z. It's like you walk into this room, what do you see? And there's a kind of that sharing is really nice.
I feel like because it's so rules, like there's a lot more freedom there for players to do that.
Yeah, and that's certainly what our gaming group has found when we've played quite a bit of it now. So it's great. I haven't played the Arkham 1692 yet, so that's definitely on the list. So just you work on horror RPGs kind of in the main. What draws you to this kind of work? What draws you to the horror mode?
It's a bit cathartic, really. So when I was younger, I was terrified of everything. I wouldn't watch a horror film for the life of me. I'd run away from it. And now I love horror more than anything. And I think it's that aesthetic. It's the stuff that you can do with locations where it's all a little bit weird and all a little bit insane. And you can twist things up and you can get a reaction from your players that's like, oh my God, or why have you done that? That's disgusting. It's getting those really visceral reactions, which I absolutely love. But also it's cathartic in general for everybody. It drives a deeper conversation when you're talking about darker themes. It gets that conversation going at the end of the session where perhaps you've had a scenario that touches on something that's quite dark and quite intense. by the end of the session, you tend to be having a debate at the end, like, how did you feel about it? What was interesting about that particular element of a dark scenario? And yeah, it's that release, that building of the tension, and then the horror hits and you go, ah, and then it's the next build up, and it's that release of sort of all of that, what's it called, hormones or chemicals, whatever it is. It's good.
yeah, and I kind of like a cyclical, like really, like you say, release of all the sort of pent up tension. That's a cool way of thinking about it. So what are your current or like future plans in terms of RPG projects? Are you working anything at the on anything at the moment?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm writing 3.
Oh, I've lost sound.
Me now?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now.
Awesome. Yeah. Sorry, my internet connection is apparently unstable, so I do apologise if I just suddenly drop out. At the moment I'm writing 3 scenarios. They're going to be self-published. So I'm trying to write them so you can kind of inject them into any system you want, but primarily they have been run with Cthulhu Dark. One of them is called Ravenous, which is set in, you are basically a group of people looking to launch an illegal rave, and you go and you discover a location which you think is going to be great for an illegal rave, and naturally you discover it's not actually as good as you think it's going to be. Then I have one that I'm writing with a friend called Rachel too, who's an excellent artist, and we're doing one called What the Trees Remember, which is a bit more of a very serious scenario set in it's the sort of covers a lot of the theme of suicide. So that one's a little bit more of an intense scenario for more serious play. And then I have another one called Last Summer, which is very much the gothic high school kind of Japanese horror where, you know, the people are climbing out the TV and trying to eat your face. So that sounds quite good.
That
so
all
hopefully
sounds like,
that will be good.
That sounds super exciting, and yeah, like you'll have to keep us up to date about those, and when they come out they sound amazing.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kathryn. So I'm going to move on to Howard now and ask Howard to tell us a little bit about the work that you've done, Howard, writing for RPGs in the past, because you've had quite a varied career on writing for RPGs, haven't you?
Yeah, so my weird claim to fame is I've got 2 citations in the Cthulhu Mythos Encyclopedia for stuff I wrote for Call of Cthulhu, neither of which is actually very good, but which turned out to be among the only adventures featuring the Hyoigor and Saigo, the great old one, who's the eyeball with the tentacles, who comes from a 1970s post-Lovecraft story. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I wrote 46 things for White Wolf, who later became Onyx Path, for their World of Darkness games, but the new World of Darkness games, which are now called Chronicles of Darkness, which aren't as good as the old World of Darkness, because I can say that because I wrote for them. No one else can say that. I think I wrote about. I think the biggest one was Vampire, Red Vampire, rather than Green Vampire, which is the good vampire. I wrote about 11 supplements for Red Vampire, including a book called The Testament of Longinus, which is their fake vampire Bible, which I wrote most of. I did that for about 6 years. I've done a fair number of indie games. I moved on to actually to being a film critic, which I've done quite well with. But I kind of kept my hat in the ring. So in 2016, I produced a game called Chariot, which is the single best thing I've ever written in any medium ever. It's about the fall of Atlantis, and the concept is that you play one of the people who is destined to witness the destruction of Atlantis, and you know exactly when and how you are going to die, which means that there is no way that you can die up to that point. So what are you going to do? And the game has a kind of, it runs with tarot cards. The system is kind of wonky. If I ever do a second edition, it's completely getting overhauled. But it runs with tarot cards. And the idea is it's based on the occult idea of Atlantis. And to take these occult histories of Atlantis, so you have from the Theosophists, from Madame Blavatsky, from Rudolf Steiner, and all those kinds of people, and essentially look at how racist and horrible and imperialist they are. And to go, well, actually, what I'm doing is a revisionist version, treating those as history, and then going, actually, this is what really happened, and this is what really happened. And these are people who were not savages, they were oppressed, and all those things like that. And to look at that. So it's a book that approaches racism, it approaches lots of other things, it approaches the destruction of what it has. My favorite thing is the catastrophe list, which is a big checklist of things, and you pick something from the list. And so in each session, one more thing happens that is disastrous. So you can pick how many before actually Atlantis sinks and everybody dies in the final session. So that's yeah, but and it's it's one of the very few things I look at and go, well, I do go, yeah, those rules aren't very good. But I also go, that's some of the best writing I've ever done. And then when I started writing We Don't Go Back, which is the guide to folk horror, I'm very proud of that too, by the way. I thought, you know, I quite fancy writing a folk horror role-playing game. Well, how would you write a folk horror role-playing game? How would you write a game that directs the player towards the experience of being a folk horror protagonist? And obviously Chloé can actually sort of like, you can probably sort of say if it works or not. But
well, I didn't come to a good end. So I think that in that sense, the folk horror mode was appeased. Because
yeah, well,
you did it right.
In folk horror, there are certain things, and among them is the idea of inevitability. In a folk horror narrative, there's that sense that the protagonist is who the bad guys wanted all along. You know, you look at movies like The Wicker Man, like Midsummer, like the 1966 Hammer film, The Witches.
I love that film. It gets forgotten in folk horror, but it's amazing. Sorry.
Yeah, and also scripted by Nigel Neal. I'm involved. One of the many things I do is that I co-host the Nigel Neal podcast, Birdcast, with my comrade John Deere, who is a patron of the BFI and a writer in his own right of many things. But yeah, and so you have these things, and that sense of inevitability, but also that sense that the landscape, and this came up in Chariot as well, that the landscape is actually a social construct. That the landscape really depends upon how the people in it interact with it. So folk horror is essentially, you have isolated landscapes with people who get a bit weird in their isolation and do something that isn't quite right in whatever way. And there are many examples of that and many different twigs on that. And it's also very, very vague. So I remember running a talk a while back and someone turned up and goes, I think Footloose is an example of folk horror, the Kevin Bacon movie. So it's kind of a wonky kind of judgment, but also that sense of inevitability comes from folk horror being the horror of folk, being that sense that the people interact with the landscape. The landscape is never uninhabited. In the UK, at least, and actually, to be fair, in the USA as well, there is nowhere that is uninhabited. There may be places that are abandoned, and there may be places that have been inhabited. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the myriad of voices on a documentary about folk horror. And one of the best bits about it is not one of my bits. It is one of the best bits is where someone talks about American folk horror, and they talk about how rubbish the ancient Indian burial ground is as a concept and how racist that is and how terrible it is. And one point that the indigenous writer, I can't even remember his name, it's terrible of me, but he says, imagine what happens when you find out the whole continent is a burial ground.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And I mean, yeah, the Atlantis game as well, Chariot, is about how the land has been utterly wrecked by people and how people are not fixing things. And because they're not fixing things, you've got to salvage something. You've got to do the smallest amount of evil you can and save who you can, even if you're not going to get out yourself. You've got to salvage something for future generations, and that's the concept of the game. And
Thank you.
what I'm into.
Yeah, there's loads of stuff you've covered there, Howard. I think it's going to be really rich when we pick up on in our panel discussion later. And obviously you're working on loads of different games as well, and kind of different sorts of world building. So I want to thank you for that intro. I am gonna move on to Nick and then Jessie, but I think we should definitely come back to some of these ideas about landscape and people and those points you've raised. So brilliant. Thank you so much, Howard. So it's Nick is next alphabetically. Is that right? I've still got my alphabet right. It's Nick. So I'm going to ask you, how does an anthropologist end up studying role-playing games? How did that happen? Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be working in game studies?
Yeah, sure. For me, at least, it was that I was an anthropology in my undergraduate, an anthropology student in undergraduate, and was really like just interested in mythology and trying to get into myth studies, and I thought that's where I was headed. And in the history of myth studies, there was this kind of debate it's in some ways comparable to the ludology narratology thing that happens in game studies, but in myth studies it was the myth ritual debate, and it was kind of a chicken egg, like did we have myths first and then rituals, or did rituals come and then we started explaining and making up stories about them? And around that time was when I first really was like having my first like deep dive into role-playing games in college, and I was like, wait a second, like the rules and the narrative and the ritual and the myth. And so like I realized that like we were doing that same thing. We were that role-playing games were about this like relationship between the thing done and the thing said, and the stories emerging out of the actions, and this kind of interplay back and forth. So that was kind of my my entry point into it. And then that the other parts of anthropology that connected up with me were in thinking about folklore, especially when we look at, well, I mean, even the games that we have here today of like this kind of very like folkloric sort of transmission, and like the kind of the hacking that we're always doing on games is exactly like how folklore spreads, of like taking things and continuously readapting them, and then meeting that up with kind of performance studies and thinking through like how the performance of the role-playing game being the central thing for me as an anthropologist, and watching how people were playing. So coming across Gary Allen Fine's stuff from the 80s, and he's a sociologist, but I give him honorary anthropology status, who did an amazing ethnography that still holds up. So, but it's very much like a weird position for a while, where kind of lots of supportive anthropologists around me being like, "Oh, that's a really neat thing to study. Good luck with that." Kind of always kind of trying to figure out how to pull those worlds together. And I think that's happened in some really exciting ways in the past decade in particular.
We can sympathize with that at the Game Studies Network. Certainly Paul and I kind of trying to convince our English department colleagues that it's completely legitimate to write about games and role-playing games and board games. I also just wanted to pick up, Evan wrote, in the beginning there was only LARP, as an answer to your, what came first. And I have to say, I agree with Evan there. LARP all the way. But we're not talking about LARP tonight, even though I could talk about it all day. We won't. I want to talk about your book, Nick, Tabletop Role-Playing Games and the Experience of Imagined Worlds, which focuses on how games and players work together to build worlds, and how that world building works, what it looks like, what it means for the people involved in it. Do you mind sharing with us some of the kind of insights of your book and what your research for it revealed about role-playing games?
Sure, yeah. So, and it's worth noting that I didn't set out to write a book about world building. Initially, I thought of the project in that kind of that myth ritual thing that I started with. I was like, okay, well, I want to look at what's the relationship between rules and story, between games and narratives. And like what I ended up doing is I went out and did ethnographies with, wow, it's been long enough time I don't even know the number of sites that I worked with, a number of sites around the US, going to gaming conventions, and then people that I met at gaming conventions, following them back to where they were from and meeting with the people that they played games with, and doing interviews and recording and transcribing game sessions, and kind of just looking really hard at what I was seeing, trying to make sense of it. And the world part is something that really emerged out of just looking at, out of the experiences I was having and hearing what people were talking about. And so one of the a couple of the big takeaways that I had is that thinking about the history of role-playing games, and the way that I came at history in the book was because the people I was working with at the time, it was right in kind of the big initial heyday of the OSR, the old school Renaissance revival. And so a lot of what I was doing was working with them, trying to figure out how are you thinking about games? And so a lot of that, of course, involves things like thinking about the history of Dungeons and Dragons and where it came from and where it was going. And more I came through the process of writing that book to think that what we saw in the invention of role-playing games in the Twin Cities and Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in the mid-70s was a sort of reaction, not on a conscious level, but on a cultural level, and a kind of dialectic response to the disenchantment of modernity, that the experiences of wonder getting stripped out of the world, especially in the context of the 70s, where you've got a bunch of mostly nearly entirely white Midwesterners trying to figure out what's going on as Vietnam's crawling to a halt. They've got gas lines, they've got Nixon. This is just a really fraught time, and that with Dungeons and Dragons, what we have is that you have taking tools of disenchantment and like what Max Weber would call that's a term from Max Weber. I mean, disenchantment, like things like numbers and statistics. And Gary Gygax was an insurance adjuster, so he was familiar with literally using statistics as a tool to put value on people's lives, on when they would die and when they wouldn't die. And so then taking that in role-playing games and turning that into a tool of re-enchantment, a way to experience other worlds, became really key for me. So then that led to just very kind of phenomenologically wanting to look at what do we mean when we say that we're collaboratively building a world together, collaboratively experiencing a world together? What is the quality, the tenor of that experience? And so looking at things like how is our experience of time in a game session, and how is the system of the game generating that experience, our experiences of space, and then really thinking about how we experience that, the connection between the world in which we're playing the game and the possible worlds that we're visiting through our play. And that's kind of the stuff I ended up thinking with as I move forward.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great summary, and people in the chat are picking up on this idea about disenchantment. I've lost Jesse. I'm bringing him back in. I think it's interesting that you're here in this panel tonight, where we've got a lot of designers who are working with horror and weird and gothic, because those are exactly the modes that were a response to the disenchantment of the Enlightenment as well. A kind of thinking about the things that still scared people, thinking about superstition, thinking about ghosts. So it's great to hear you talk about it in those terms. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about your work on the potential of games in educational spaces. I know this is kind of early work that you're working on right now. Can you tell us more about what you think the potential is there on games as kind of educational tools or educational spaces themselves?
Yeah, so basically with that, I've increasingly come to think of games in general as ways for us to, like I said, to shape, to create particular rules that hold inside a world. I mean, that's not my thought. Obviously, that's something that's bouncing all over, from hoisting it forward. But thinking about how course design is already game design. So I'm not primarily thinking in terms of gamification, but that we're dealing with a thing that is already structuring a set of experiences for a group of people. And so I've been thinking about trying to draw as much as I can resources from the wide world of game design, and think about how those can structure learning communities in various ways, and trying to implement that in my own teaching. So in a lot of that is just based in more broadly thinking that what we can do with games is to get to imaginatively access worlds that are different from our own in ways that are useful to us in a wide variety of ways, whether that's for political change, sparking political imagination, or in a classroom, just imagining a different way of of learning things together. And so rather than going into like particular things that I'm trying in those experiments, that's what's guiding those experiments, is just viewing the classroom as this alternate world that we're generating through the rules of a syllabus.
Yeah, that's brilliant to hear, and hopefully that's going to lead to some really interesting things for you and your students as well. So I'm going to come to Jessie now, and we'll hear a little bit about Jessie's work, and then we'll hear from all the panelists again when we have our discussion. So thanks to Nick. So Jessie, we're last but not least, but we might cycle back to thinking about Cthulhu Dark a little bit. So your work on Trophy is in part inspired by the Cthulhu Dark system, but can you tell us a little bit more about what Trophy is, how it came about? It's coming out very, very soon. So
Trophy as an entity actually came out, I believe it was end of 2018. As a short game in the Codex magazine, which is put out by the Gauntlet. And Jason Cordova, who runs the Gauntlet, is in the chat. So hi, Jason. And it was originally simply a way for me to play in some other settings that were still had kind of like the D&D-ish fantasy trappings, but were focused more on horror than heroics. And rather than looking at a rule set like D&D or similar, I wanted to look at a rule set that was really based in and rooted in the idea of horror, because that was the part of this idea of like going into a scary forest that I was most interested in. I wanted to look at the forest as the idea of cosmic horror, similar to what we would see in the Cthulhu stories. So looked at Cthulhu Dark. It was a rule set that I had already really loved and was excited about and interested in, and used that as the foundation with a little bit of technology from Blades in the Dark to make the game a little more collaborative.
Can't hear me. Sorry, I've muted myself. Sorry, Jessie. No, thanks for that explanation. And you'll see that I kind of stole the tagline for Trophy a little. Someone's noticed in the chat that I stole the tagline for Trophy a little bit for this event title, because it's really evocative, isn't it? This idea about that line about entering a forest that doesn't want you there, and that's what fascinates me about what you've done with that game. The sense of the agency of the game world, the agency of the environment. How do you think the mechanics work there to kind of making the setting do that? Kind of, it's not just a background, it's doing something in the game, it's doing something to the players. And what would you say your approach is to that, like that interaction of rules and gameplay, or rules and storytelling, or however we've been like trying to think about it tonight? Yeah,
that's a great question. So for me, part of this was about flipping the kind of default fantasy RPG narrative on its head, that you're like these heroes who are going out and exploring and doing brave, adventurous things, as well as also flipping like kind of the default narrative of who tells the story and who owns the story on its head. So in Trophy, you specifically Trophy Dark, which was the first game in the series, you play doomed treasure hunters who are going into a forest that doesn't want them there. And the idea of the forest being an active agent, and the players not being heroes, but being like literally an invasive species in this space, was something that was really interesting to me. The adventures or adventure modules in Trophy are called incursions because you are the bad guys. Like you play the bad guys, and the stories are largely one-shots. And so it ends with you being dead, broken, destroyed in some way. And that idea of like knowing the ending when you go into it, similar to what Howard's mentioned, is freeing. It's liberating. It opens up gameplay in a whole host of ways, because you don't have to preserve your character. You can think about the story as a whole and the role that this character plays in it, rather than thinking exclusively about this character being a proxy for me and a heroic fantasy that I'm pushing myself into this world.
Yeah, I actually love that all of you tonight have talked about that idea of like the character, embracing the character's doom in order to kind of go for the story. It's the story that's the most important thing. Yeah. What is great about Trophy 2 that I've been discovering as well, just very recently coming to the Gauntlet community, is its contribution to the continuing development of the indie RPG community. Because it's developed on a Creative Commons license, other folks can take the rule set and build new games and new worlds from them. And there's quite a lot of now what you call rooted in trophy games out there, from one set in kind of very, like the forest settings that you've originally imagined, but also seashores and even outer space, starships floating in distant galaxies. What have been some of your favorite adaptations of the trophy system?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about horror is it's a universal human experience, right? So you can play these types of games anywhere, right? As long as there are people who are scared of things, you can play a horror game in that setting. There's lots of games. It would take me the rest of this session to list all of them that I love, but I'll give a special shout out to everything that a group of designers called the Cold Hearth Collective has put out. Lots of awesome, amazing work there. And if someone hits me up later on, I can get you a link to all of their cool stuff. There's a game called Sunken by Mike Martins, which is a nautical horror, which is super awesome. We were talking before this session, their Hollows of Desolation by Gordy Murphy is really great. The Labyrinth by Riley Rithal is really great. It's like it takes some more like kind of Powered by the Apocalypse DNA, so you play more of an archetype of a character, which is really great. Lots of cool stuff coming over the Gauntlet gaming community, which you mentioned, and Trophy has its own Discord, and there's lots of stuff like actively being developed and people coming together and coming up with ideas and chiming in on each other's ideas that I really love. This is a collaborative hobby, and the process of making games should also be collaborative.
Yeah, totally. No, it's lovely. I've just kind of dipping my toe in the Gauntlet community, and it's such a great space. I know it's a horrible question to ask you, because I know that you've basically been working flat out over the last few weeks to get like the kind of new edition of Trophy. As you said, it did come out a few years ago through the Codex, but it's kind of launching as it's kind of the full kind of Trophy Dark, Trophy Gold, and Trophy Loom, those 3 books. And I know you've been working flat out to get those ready for people, but what's next for you and Hedgemaze Press, do you think?
Lots of trophy stuff. We have a lot planned after all of this comes out, so keep an eye out for more setting books and factions and lots of cool stuff for playing in the world of Trophy. I'm also working on a lot of kids games. Actually, I have an 8-year-old daughter. I also have a 17-year-old daughter, but she doesn't play as much with me anymore. But I've been playing a lot of games with my 8-year-old daughter, and I'm very interested in the idea of how you can take the simple mechanics that I love and use every day and just apply those to games with kids too. So expect lots of kids stuff from me in the future too.
I cannot wait, because my 10-year-old keeps making me play D&D with him, and I don't want to play D&D with him. I want to play other stuff. Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone so far for kind of giving us a bit more of a deep dive into your work and your role-play philosophies. So we're going to move on to the next part of the panel, which is our moderated discussion, and I'm going to pose some questions about the theme of this event, some of which you've touched on already, but we can kind of maybe come back to some of the points that you've raised. And I guess we'll just, if you've got something to say, just go ahead and say it, and we'll figure it out as we go. So my first question is, what do we think the attraction is for players to these sorts of creepy, eerie, weird, and horrifying environments? Maybe Nick could start us off, because he's been in lots of player groups.
I mean, this is off the cuff thinking, but I think that part of what we see is that all of these games are games that part of the appeal is just the focus on the environment and on the ambiance. That's something that's foregrounded in a lot of these games, and so there's kind of the horror aspect, but then there's also just that. To communicate that goal by its very nature, it requires communicating very strong senses of other worlds, or at least other imaginings of this world. And I think that I don't know, that's one of the things that runs through it to me. But as you pointed out earlier, that that the kind of horror that's inspiring these works is a reaction to disenchantment and to enlightenment, and kind of the horror of modernity. Like, and so the fact that we are all living in this like nightmarish reality, games that like point out that like what living in a nightmarish reality feels like, I think are pretty useful, because they help us figure out what's going on around us too.
Yeah, and I was going to say something off the cuff, like playing Trophy Dark is a lot less horrifying than having Boris Johnson as your prime minister, but I shouldn't say that really in an official. I did, now it's too late, sorry. What do we think on the panel, that the attraction of these kinds of games might be?
Something that I definitely think it's very different, whoever you are. There are some people who are going in and they want to find out what the story is. What's the ending of this story? I want to find out what happens. There's some people who are, what happens, what's behind the door? What's behind door number 1? And it's that element of fear. Is it going to freak me out, or is it going to be quite mundane? Something that I really like about these particular stories are the twists and the turns. I go in thinking that it's going to be one way, and actually it flips itself entirely on its head, and actually it was completely different from what I expected it to do. And I like that element of surprise. I like being caught off guard, and I feel like horror really lends itself to that. And again, it's that sense of tension that you can build with these games, and the interactions that you can get between different people. So I feel like the horror setting, that darkness, that creepiness, it invokes a very primal thing in a person, and our instincts are fight or flight, and part of that is finding out the story, finding out, do I want to flee from this, or do I want to carry on and fight it and find out what happens?
The hook of sorry, Howard, I was just going to say, the hook.
I think one of the central things about horror, and indeed many of the reasons why we play role-playing games, is also connection. In that, when we're in a horror movie, you put yourself in the place of someone in that movie in some sort of way, or you, even in the sense of negatively doing so, is like going, I wouldn't go down into that cellar. But you do this thing, I think, when you're in a horror game with other people, is that you're all in this together and you all build it up together. You all feed on each other's excitement and everything. A very well-designed horror game will actually have it in the rules. One of the greatest horror systems ever is the basic Call of Cthulhu sanity system, which ironically, the more realistic they try to make it, the less effective it's become, and the less realistic it's become. It's very weird. But, that whole thing where your sanity points get lower, and the lower they get, the more likely they are to get lower, is kind of, and the more likely you are to get more and more traumatized and more messed up, is kind of just this sense of tension. I know that the last time I played Call of Cthulhu, we were playing Horror on the Orient Express. When my Irish priest's sanity points got down to about 18.
That's not good in a percentage system. That's
not good in a percentage system. Yeah, everybody goes, we all play Call of Cthulhu, 18 SAN, you just go, it's like, oh, this is going to end well. There's that sense of rising tension, but when you have a group of people who you trust, and trust is essential in a horror game, more so than any other game, that can ramp up. Again, I think also of Vampire, which I know doesn't have a particularly good name in a lot of the old school indie game community, particularly. I remember one very early indie game theorist something just deciding that it literally gave you brain damage, and he meant literally. But there is, Vampire has this whole, oh God, what have I done thing, and the rules and also the community join together to create. And Vampire also has a weird sort of dissonance in its rules, in that like, you have cool powers, but in order to have the cool powers, you have to do horrible things. And in order to do horrible things, to have the cool powers, and it just sort of goes up to the and these things all in the community. When you have the community of players around the table, or in the current scene in the windows on your screen, you have that sense that you're all building each other up, and it's quite intense, isn't it? It's quite powerful. These are often our most memorable things. So, and you know, sometimes when you overcome the horror, sometimes these are the stories that we actually sometimes tell the fellow members of the game. Do you remember when the cult of Nyarlathotep was outside the museum office, and then Big Dave's character said, "I've seen your god and he's made of clay," and then he rolled 6 critical rolls and killed them all? And this sort of thing is quite powerful.
I completely agree on that, because I have long bonded over a friend of mine called Scott Dorwood for the sheer amount of times that he's killed me in creative ways. And there is always that moment where it's like, "Oh, Scott, do you remember when I was just about to save the entire party from a blood ritual and then you jumped into the hole that the god was in and made it come alive?" It's like, "Oh yeah, I remember
exactly.
that. Yeah." And you're like, "Oh."
Yeah, the time around Masks of Nyarlathotep, and we did 22 sessions. It took nearly a year, and I did a total player kill on the final session. And although this was 18 years ago, I've still not been forgiven by it.
And nor should you be. I wanted to pick up on something that Howard said there that maybe Jessie can come in on about, you know, sometimes it's a feeling of what have we done or what have I done, or that not the horror of the things you're confronting, but the horror of the things that you're doing or that you're becoming. And is that part of the appeal as well, maybe?
Yeah, I mean that's a core part of the trophy experience. As you get to the fifth ring, the idea is that you're going deeper and deeper into the forest in trophy, and at the fifth ring, the horror is yourself. Like, that is the thing that you are confronting. And I think there is something liberating about playing through those kind of experiences and realizing that I think it was brought up in the chats and on Twitter somewhere, Chloe, that your trophy dark character was the worst character you've ever made or played.
Oh, don't ask Kevin what I did to him during that game.
There's something freeing about that experience, right? About playing a sort of unredeemable person and realizing that it is just a play. Like, we love flawed characters in the stories that we watch and read and listen to.
Yeah. Thank you for all those comments. I'm going to move on to a question now, and I might ask Paul to come in first on this one, just because I know, Paul, that you've done some kind of work on this. So the question is really about how we build settings, what that includes, what does that mean, what does the setting involve, and how we build it as perhaps as writers, as GMs and players. And I'm coming to Paul first, because you've actually done some work. Part of your offer on Cthulhu Hack is there's a book, isn't there, which is about how to write a story for Cthulhu Hack and how to like build a setting in the like Lovecraftian world, and you take the reader through Haunter of the Dark and how to turn that into a game. So just wonder if you could reflect on that question about, you know, what is an environment in a game and how do we make it? What's it made up of?
I think it connects into what I said earlier, actually, about Lovecraft, The Haunter of the Dark. It's a weird story for me to have chosen, because it was the last one he wrote, and it was kind of like a jokey poke back at another author. And however, it is incredibly, it's a really good story with, again, very deep imagery, and it, because of that, because every single sentence seems to have been steeped in this, the themes and atmosphere, this whole business of this church on Federal Hill, in the author of the story can see in the distance, and this constant lure to draw him in and take him on this journey that culminates, and spoiler alert or whatever, in ultimately him becoming as one with the horror and seeing these unknowable vistas. It seemed to me that was an excellent example. You know, I'm sure Lovecraft wasn't thinking of how you can take somebody through an adventure and an investigation or an adventure or whatever you're playing in. And these Call of Cthulhu has this onion skin. I don't know whether they came up with it, but this idea that you peel back the onion skin, you find different layers as you get deeper into an investigation. And if anything, Haunter of the Dark is a prime example of it. And so I wrote Haunter of the Dark on that basis of digging through every single line to the level of reading it again and again and again. And actually, I commented to somebody the other day about this and it raised a laugh, but some people don't read books. There you go. No, as in, so they don't they don't read the book. They'll almost run through the story, but they don't read the book. I mean, you get to the end of it and you've experienced something, but you've not actually read the story and you've not taken anything on from it, and all too easily it will slip away. And by the idea behind the Haunter of the Dark was to just go through it again and actually consider the lines and consider what Lovecraft is suggesting, because within that story, the back of the Haunter of the Dark book is an annotated version that picks out pretty much almost every other line a concept or an idea that could be spun off into its own hook for a new adventure or its own idea. And then at the beginning of the book, I walk through those steps of taking those elements and do like I create an adventure which is a sequel to the Haunter of the Dark, because spoilers, the Haunter doesn't die. Yeah, it's fascinating to actually approach a writer like that and actually look at stories and use them as a source for because it's a good way to actually engage players then, because maybe especially if they've read the story themselves, you can then actually bind it into a more immersive experience overall when you begin to introduce them to things that happen afterwards or before. Or
so it's not just about a good plot, it's about this rich textured, like you start with the church on the hill, which is like this hook, this lure, this draw, and then it's digging into the layers and the textures of that creates the game. That's a lovely description and really interesting insights. What do we think about kind of what makes and how environments and players and GMs interact to kind of build worlds in games?
I think it's very much like, Paul, what you were saying about the Haunter and the Dark scenario. Like, part of it is knowing where you are going to go and being able to visualize it. So there's people who will have read that story and they will be able to see clearly in their mind the way the church looks. And when you are role playing that and the GM is talking about going into that church and looking around and finding objects that have featured in the story, you as a player can visually picture it in your mind, and it's more of an interactive experience. But even if you haven't read that story, the sheer fact that the GM is able to construct this church and these rooms and these objects and describe them, you can build that picture in your head. And it's very much an interactive experience, not a passive one. Like you were saying, Paul, when you're reading a book, you don't necessarily read the book. You've just gone from start to finish and you're like, I actually didn't read 3 of those pages. But when you're in a role play game, you have to pay attention to the detail, because you need to go over there and have a look at that chest because there might be something in it. Or, okay, well, they've just said that tunnel is incredibly dark and there's a strange sound of skittering down there. Well, I've already built up a picture in my mind. What if I go towards the skittering? Maybe I shouldn't go towards the skittering. Maybe I should back away from the skittering. It's way more interactive, and I think that makes it more personal, because then the player is going out and touching that thing. They're going out and they're doing something with it. It's not you're reading a book and you're going, and then there was a church and it was really dark and really scary and there was a door and the person went up to the door. It's you are standing in front of a really scary, dark church. What do you want to do? And your player could be like, I'm going to go and touch the really scary door. Or they might be like, I'm leaving.
One of the really
go ahead, Howard.
ways in which Lovecraft lends himself, Lovecraftian horror and cosmic horror lends itself really to this sort of thing, is the fact that, and I mean, we kind of failed it. I mean, you mentioned earlier on about Lovecraft's adjectives, Paul. And you know, as someone eldritch, scaly and rugose myself, I do quite like a good adjective. But the Lovecraft both actively encouraged fan fiction, but also his descriptions are nowhere near as detailed as you think they are. That's one of the good things about Lovecraft, and one of the places where people who imitate Lovecraft fall down. Like, so the best Lovecraft description is in The Festival of a Monster, which he describes as a bit like an ape and a bit like an ant and a bit like a bat, but actually nothing like either of them. And that's more or less what he says. And the Call of Cthulhu game very early on gave it a name. They called it a Bjarki, and then like described it as a cross between a batterbug and an ape. But actually, it's not. It's nothing like any of them, but it feels like those things. But role-playing games are great because there's only so much time to mount a description. On a book page, you could be like Dickens and write 10,000 words because you paid by the word about a door handle because that's what Dickens was like. But you, in a role-playing game, you're immediate and stuff, so you have to pick important details, things. You describe a room, so you're in a room, right, and there are gilded cherubs on the ceilings and there's silk curtains, and you don't need to describe the color of the wallpaper or the carpet or anything. You just like those two details immediately give you what sort of room it is. And the players fill that in themselves, and you have this sort of apophenia. It's not really apophenia, that's a different psychological thing, but this thing where we have enough details to create the gaps ourselves. And because we created the gaps ourselves, they are that much more elemental.
I think that's a bit like, I suppose it's kind of like putting into gameplay what happens all the time when your brain is always filling in the gaps, right? It's picking out little details and filling in the gaps. And in role-playing games, you're just doing that in this like hugely imaginative way. That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I like this idea that you just pick out one or two little things, and then that room comes to life for the players, but possibly in quite different ways. Jesse, you were going to come in before. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to bounce off of what Kathryn was saying in terms of one of the things that I found is super effective in horror games, and something that's built into Trophy, is this idea that whenever you make a roll in a game, you ask the whole table what could go wrong. So rather than the GM deciding what the result is, or even the player saying how they fail, both of which are great options, everyone gets to chime in on what a possible terrible outcome might be. And one, that just gives everyone a chance to participate, right? It makes the table more engaging in a moment that might be focused on an individual person. It lets everyone share in that. And it gives the GM and other players ideas, because once those things are spoken, they linger, right? And so it's something that you can constantly return back to. It's like a foreshadowing. It's a form of foreshadowing, right? Or opening the door of what the possibilities might be.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. The devil's bargain mechanic that in Trophy is so good for that. I'm going to just move the discussion on a little bit so we've got time. There's so much going on in the chat, and I do want to come to some of those questions. But I also want to, there's a couple of issues I want to touch on before we finish our panel discussion, and partly because they're, I make no apologies, it's partly because they're on my mind at the moment, and it's the idea of, and I also think because the potential particularly of Jesse's work as well, but it's the idea that the environment becoming a kind of ever more urgent idea, shaped by obviously our growing awareness of the climate crisis. And I think I might start with Nick with this one, but I'm wondering what we think role-playing game worlds and game environments might have anything to contribute to this context of kind of living through a climate crisis. How can playing in imagined environments maybe help us think about the environment we are living in? So yeah, Nick, a tough question, but I wonder if you could start us off with some thoughts.
I mean, at the risk of sounding like like I'm repeating myself, I think that part of the starting point is to realize that we're already playing a whole set of games with our environment. Like we're playing LARPs I play a LARP with my yard all the time. And so like one of the things I've kind of a manuscript I'm working on is like turning the rituals of like my bourgeois American white middle class upbringing that I had of how to relate to nature, and writing those out as if they were like a micro RPG that I was playing. Like, look at your lawn and think about all of the other things that exist in it besides the one plant that you want to live there, and how and just kind of getting you to imagine those things. And so like realizing, I think the starting point is, like I said, to realize we're already playing a set of games with everything, with the world that we're in, that depends on imagining the world a certain way, and that then we act on that, and it makes that world a certain way, because we're always imagining a world that's different than it is. And that's how we got here in the first place, is a bunch of people like 400 years ago started saying like, ooh, what if like the entire experienceable world was like tameable and like actually just useful for making profit for capitalists. Wouldn't that be a great game to play? And then we played that game for 400 years, right? So starting with that as a starting point, then you can think, well, like, how can I shake my imagination out and imagine the world in different ways? And then what would that lead me to do? How would that lead me to act differently?
Yeah, I like we've talked about this before, you and I, Nick, and I like that you picked up on the quote from the Adam Curtis documentary about the truth about the world is that we make it, and we could just as easily make it any other way. And I like your idea that role-playing games have a kind of, they're a way of thinking through that. Thank you for that. It's a tough question, isn't it? Climate, the environment, these are really difficult concepts for people. Yeah, we can understand the science of it. Yeah, we can understand, we know what's happening, but to actually grasp it and what it means, it's tough for individuals anyway. Yeah.
I think there's also, sorry to
come
in.
Go
I
for
think
it, Kathryn.
There's some people who really like horror that they know is not real. So things like ghosts and monsters and things that lurk in the dark that are not actually going to come and kill you at night. The environment is a very real horror. This is a real thing that's happening. And some people find that a little bit too close to home. They don't want to have to face real horror. Whereas there's this cosmic horror that may or may not exist. Some people find that they can disassociate from that at the end of the game session. Whereas if you've got a game session that's very much about the environment, or about, for example, one of my game sessions that I'm writing for is the mental health and the suicide, it's more difficult to take yourself away from that. So that depends on your player group, how comfortable they are with things. But I do think that it's very true, much like novels and cinema and various other forms of media, you can use tabletop role-playing to send a message. And if that message is, this is scary because it is scary and we should probably think about it, I think that's not a bad thing. But again, it is down to your players and their comfort level, and you do have to take that into consideration when you're playing something so interactive.
Yeah, and I think there are some really interesting games out there, things like they are the Horrors of Desolation, where the the potential for thinking through eco stuff with that game is amazing, and could lead to all sorts of really interesting conversations about the impacts that humans have on the environment and our interactions, that we are part of the environment. They like to imagine that we're not, and all of that stuff. But it's done in this game that is, fantastic worlds where magic is real. And so there's that, it's a cipher for those conversations without someone kind of confronting you directly with like, well, you get in your car every day, you're causing climate change. It's kind of an interesting vehicle for having those difficult conversations, perhaps.
I think getting people involved in it, getting people talking about it, making people understand the difficulties, but not beating people over the head with a stick. There's a difference in how you do that with games. So.
And I have one last question, and perhaps it's maybe something that Jessie might want to come in on as well. And again, it's chiming with my own thinking, and it's this feature of the climate crisis as a sense of a world that's alive, that's come alive, that it's got this agency that we didn't really realize. As Nick said, we thought it was just stuff that we could use. It turns out it's got like its own systems that we've interfered with, feedback loops and all sorts of things. And at the same time as that is going on, it's also made us more aware of like the human impact is much bigger than perhaps we imagined. So there's this weird tension there, like the world has got this agency and then humans have got this agency, and then maybe games can help us figure that out, because games are really interested, I think, aren't they, in like agencies, and like whether you're the doomed player, whether it's the monster or there's something in the church, like the locus of agency or who has agency in games is always shifting around, and they're really interested in like experimental spaces for figuring out, like Howard's game, for example, like there's some agency in the landscape itself, maybe in the stone circle itself, or maybe it's in the people that have made that land the way that it is. It's certainly not in the character player. So yeah, I wonder if or maybe it is, maybe it moves around. So I guess that's a question for us all to think about, your games and agency maybe, and where we think agency is in those games, particularly in environments that are inhospitable.
I think that, in the Shivering Circle is a game where the agency is with the characters to the extent that you get, well, it's more with the player than with the character, I think. It was interesting to hear about the what can go wrong mechanic. That sounds amazing. But the Shivering Circle has a thing where essentially if you win the role, you get to decide what happens. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what your character wants to happen. You might consider it to be a bad thing that happens. The games master, the narrator, might decide what happens might actually benefit you, or decide to go easy on you or whatever if you lose. But it's about the decision of what happens, about the handing over of agency voluntarily. I think that there is agency in the characters, because to remove agency altogether isn't fun. And I think there needs to be the illusion of agency at least. And that's not ideal either. There has to be some sort of agency for it to be able to be gamified, to work as a game. Because you're just standing there being railroaded. It's
it's a difficult balance, isn't it? It's a difficult tension. I like the distinction you're making between character and player as well. Does anyone else want to come in on this question before? I'm just thinking about going to Q&A as well, but I am interested in hearing what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think a lot about the belonging outside belonging model of divvying up player roles too. I think that's a place ripe for continued exploration, where in those games you play a character and you play an aspect of the environment or the setting. And I think as a player, having influence over both of those can give you a broader respect for like kind of the desires of the environment, right? There are things you're incentivized to do that give the environment agency, and playing outside of the context of an individual person, I think is a really powerful experience for us, feeling a deeper awareness of things outside of the human body and human experience.
Yeah, no, I really like that idea. Nick, yeah.
Yeah, on the agency question, I've increasingly started to think of, just as a thought experiment, of games as, and I mean this as literally as you can take it, but without thinking me insane, as vehicles, as vehicles or machines that we use to literally explore the multiverse, like every possible when you say what are the things that could possibly go wrong in the game, what you're saying is like what are the worlds adjacent to the one that we know that we're in that we're exploring right now. What are the 5 other adjacent worlds that we might be interested in steering the ship to next? And so when we think about agency in a game, in that metaphor, it's what are the workstation, what are the, like in Star Trek, like what are the different stations at this machine, and what levers can be pulled and who gets to pull them, is a way that I think about, like trying to distribute that, and thinking about all the different wide variety of combinations with which you can make one of these kind of multiversal exploration vehicles that is a game.
I love it.
I don't know why, that just reminds me of all of the films and all of the books, like the Choose Your Own Adventure books, and how you would pick up that book and you would choose your own adventure, but then you'd flip to all the other pages to see what happens if you had gone a different way. Or like those TV programs like Groundhog Day, where you repeat the same day over and over again, but you see what you can do. It's kind of like why we like stuff like that. We like seeing what happens.
Yeah, I love this idea that role-playing games in particular, but also other kinds of games, are like machines to get through to the multiverse. It's a very cool idea. Cool. Well, we're at 6:30 now, so we're way off my time schedule, but that's okay. It's fine. We're having a lovely time. I'd love to open this to questions from the audience, and as I've said, you can direct those questions to kind of what general points that we've been talking about, or maybe to a particular person on the panel, whatever we think. So I'm just looking through now to see if I've got. So Martin says, "What is the future for talking RPGs?" I'm not sure what he means by talking RPGs. I have missed a bit of the message. I'm going to go back
You
through.
mean tabletop RPGs, like around the table where you talk?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I guess so, because it's like the world of Zoom or whatever. I know, for example, we've been, talking as opposed to computer. Thank you, Martin. I see, because of course, other people in game studies, when they talk about role-playing games, they're not necessarily talking about what we're talking about. So yeah, I guess it's a really interesting question, actually, because certainly the last year I've done all my role-playing online through Zoom, and it's been amazing because I've actually met people that through that I wouldn't have played with before, and I've been introduced to games that I wouldn't have played before, and it's been fantastic. But it is a very different kind of experience to role-playing around the table, and a different kind of a different experience of world building thus arises because you're doing it through this different medium. So I think it's a fascinating question, actually, what the future is for tabletop role-playing games.
I think as we move towards more and more of a technical age, we're going to be craving more and more of a physical outlet, and I think that the talking RPG is never going to die. And I think from what I have seen, more and more people of all different ages are getting into roleplay, and it's becoming more of a thing. I mean, Jeff Goldblum is doing a podcast where he's an elf. So I feel like it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. It's becoming a little bit more widely accepted. And I think the more that we are stuck at our computers working in a digital age day by day, the more we're going to want that social around the table, especially after lockdown. I, for one, cannot wait until lockdown lifts and I can have a game session with people around it. Not only because it's fun to roleplay online, you've got a lot of useful resources like, Roll20, but there's nothing quite like rolling your own dice on a hardwood table and hearing the sound and everybody around the table cheering when you hit a crit. And there's nothing quite like being able to see facial expressions up close and in person, and being able to see those hand gestures and getting involved that way. There's a lot to be said for the body language part of role-playing that gets missed out by sort of the Zoom calls. Don't get me wrong, online role-playing is really good fun, opens a lot of avenues, but there's something very special about a table role-play.
No, it is interesting. I know, Paul, you have done a lot of work, like kind of convention tabletop games, and where you've delivered role-playing games at conventions. What's that been like the past year for you, kind of getting your games out there in the Zoom world? Has that been tricky? Has that been hard?
It's been a world of silence. To be honest, it's ultimately impacted me to the extent of my virtually not role-playing at all.
Wow.
For some reason, and I suffer from anxiety, and bizarrely enough, somebody who has in the past sat down with people at a table to game master with a group of people I've never met before, an adventure that could go horribly wrong, that doesn't impact me as much for some reason as actually the additional distance of gaming through whatever medium online. It's meant I've gone from somebody who runs and plays adventures weekly to being able to, last year I could count the games I played on my two hands. This year I've just tweaked over that by getting into a campaign where I've been lucky enough to be involved in an ongoing adventure. But ultimately, actually, there is some fundamental difference which I can't get over, and that does present a challenge in terms of being able to push through things like playtesting. But thankfully, for example, in the case of Desanction, I've been playtesting that for the last 7 years, so I actually had quite a lot of stuff just to gather together, and as a result of which I've not suffered too much. But if we had another year of it, I think it would be a genuine challenge to produce new adventures, because I find it difficult to actually play online.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Anna. We should probably not skip over that. Like, there's a lot of positivity about the Zoom. We're all here from different places around the world, and it's fantastic, but it's not easy for everyone. And it's also, there's a kind of level of access as well that you need to have to be able to do it. And also it does create a very different kind of game as well. So yeah, I think they're all really important points. And
sorry.
No, please jump in.
I was just going to add to that. So, for example, one of my friends is not able to roleplay because they have sight difficulties and a computer that is not good enough to handle a lot of stuff, because the Dungeons and Dragons that we do is mainly done on Roll20 or on Foundry. There are no accessibility options really that they can use because it's not built in. So from a disability point of view, it's really difficult for them to get in and role play, because if they're at the table, they could have somebody there who could advise them, or they could have a sort of, they can feel the dice, they have that communication and being able to talk. But now that it's all computer based, because there's only so much you can do, they really struggle. So there is that downside, is it's not as accessible for a lot of people as we think it might be.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Nick. Yeah.
I think that, like, on a broad level, I think that part of the event of, or part of the consequences of the pandemic more broadly, like you said, that there's a longing for like physical connection and physical interactivity. But part of what I think what has happened is that we've become more acutely aware of the particular characteristics of like what translates through a digital medium and what doesn't, and like even on the accessibility things, that slices all kinds of different ways too. There are lots of people who are experiencing like increased access to a variety of spaces now because they're more able to get through online. And so I think that part of looking forward is being aware, to me the future is hybridized in hopefully in intelligent and thoughtful and caring ways, that we can think through like what it means to have presence in all of these different kinds of ways, and how to bring people together in as many different modalities as possible, and leaning into the strengths of the various modes that we can interact with each other.
Thank you. Yeah. So to go back to something that we were talking about before, Robert says a couple of the speakers mentioned the freedom that accepting your character is going to die and the players are probably going to lose, grants to the role play or to the storytelling that there's a kind of freedom there. And he says, I think that's a really important point, but do you think there's any way to transfer that to other genres of RPGs or other types of different genres of games? So is it just something, I guess, that's in the horror game? Nick?
Yeah, that's something in my fieldwork for my book that came up a lot, because in like old school gaming and like the old school D&D like mortality curve of characters just dying and being very vulnerable. One of the things that came through is very similar kinds of language, but not in a horror context at all, of just that the world that they were building together, especially in like a long term, some of these are like 10-year campaigns that they've been playing in, where you're retiring characters too. It means that the character isn't at the foreground of the experience, that it's the world that we're exploring together that's at the foreground. And I think any place that you have that, and you can get it through character death, but also through other ways of decentering these standardized player character relationship. Even like shared protagonists, I think, do this to some extent, where the entire table is sharing a protagonist. Anywhere where you're destabilizing that idea of my goal is to like live in this world and maximize my personal benefits as a character as much as possible.
There's a classic role-playing game, Ars Magica, where you have, everybody's got their main player character, but there's also this pool of sidekick characters that people just share. So you might, you've got like, Magus or Archilochus or whatever, and then you've got like Ulrich the thug, who's just like there mowing the lawn, and they have to go out for an event. You get one wizard and everybody else takes turns picking out somebody from the pile, and that's kind of nice because it's this kind of shared pool of people and that sort of thing. I think that's an example of exactly what you're talking about more than anything, really.
Yeah, there's a game called Symbaroum, who Jess might be familiar with, because Trophy has certain connections with it, and it has a very grim, dark feel of adventuring into an environment that the Forest of Davokov fundamentally, it doesn't hate you. I mean, I don't think the environment is capable. It is an anathema to life, and the deeper you go, the more risk you take. And as a result of which, in being part of the community around that game, I found that players who came from high fantasy games struggled with it because the characters are not built to survive, but they were desperately finding ways to build their character to make them survive. They wanted the right build. They wanted the ogre with the two-handed sword, which had this skill and that skill, which meant they could deal 50 damage in one strike. But from the very start, and I started a blog called The Iron Pact, where I said, you really need to, the game is beautiful to start with, fantastic art, but you need to grasp the concept that this is about adventuring with the very real possibility of your own mortality, and that you are going to give yourself up to that environment. And so you have troop play, that you have a group of adventurers, very much like the Ars Magica approach, and accept that as a group you will change over time because different people will be involved, and you're like that classic idea of almost an adventurers guild, that people who have a common interest. But again, rather like as I was saying with Cthulhu Hack, where it's the conspiracy, the overarching threat that matters most, the guild would then matter most, and you could have characters and you could go into adventure not so connected to your character that you're not willing to give it up, very much as Trophy does, where you have that opportunity, where you've got to the point where your ruin has hit 6 and you have that final sort of denouement, that you will leave the game, but you will do it on your own terms, and it will be glorious for the fact you've left, not because you are going home with a sack full of gold, but because you had a horrific demise, which is memorable. But there's someone else to pick up next week. You don't have to be so connected to your character.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have so like this game Chariot, I wanted to come up with the idea that one of the character types can't lose a violent fight, but all that does is it takes violence off the table. People know that he's the invincible charioteer. They have to run away. They have to hide. Because he can't lose, and that sort of thing. Also, what are the consequences of not losing a violent fight? What does that make you? If you can single-handedly destroy an entire army in a field of what sort of person are you? But then to bring that all together, where none of your characters can die until this session, where the catastrophe list is filled up, and it's like, okay, this is the session where you all die. How do you die? And do that to actually create the death that, or even mechanically create a death spiral, like Call of Cthulhu does, really. That's what the sanity mechanic is a death spiral. But it's a death spiral that gives the illusion that you might get out of it.
You won't, though.
You won't. But then that's kind of fun, isn't it? It's like Nightmare on Elm Street, isn't it? Maybe she could make Freddy Krueger go away by saying she doesn't believe in him. But actually, nah, not at all. That sort of sense that by actually manipulating the ways in which these fictions that we create around the table are constructed in terms of death and in terms of mortality, we can tell different sorts of stories.
Yeah, that's such an important point. Thank you for that. Yeah, like it's as much about how you construct. Yeah, that's why this whole ludology narratology thing doesn't work, right? Because those two things are so enmeshed. I've got a question from Fred, who he's coming from Dungeons and Dragons and combat heavy systems that often require battle maps and the like. What are the panel's thoughts about the use of maps in and out of combat, as opposed to just world building in the theatre of the mind? His phrase is the theatre of the mind. I can see that maps might undermine the creepiness of the atmosphere and the creativity of role playing, but what are your thoughts?
I think that depends entirely on how you use the map, because there are things that you can do with maps that can be really creepy. So if you give them just part of a map or pieces of a map and they've got to try and put it together, but they're in a very tense environment where the darkness is creeping in and they have to try and read it by candlelight, you could essentially make that at the game table, where you dim the lights and you give them fragmented pieces of the map and you just put candles up and you're like, you're in a dark room, you have found the map, now you've got to put it together. And then a couple of seconds pass as the players try to put this map together and you're like, you over there, you hear something move. It sounds like slithering behind you. And then you just stop and let them try to put that map together. You can do some really interesting things with physical props in your game. And when it comes to maps, that kind of stuff, bringing those in, if you want to give them a map, they might have that map, but that doesn't mean that the map is useful. The map might be wrong. The map might be showing things that are 10 years, 20 years out of date. It might also be that they are following this map, but that doesn't stop things from happening just because they know where they're going. In fact, it can make it worse for them if they know where they're going.
One of the Call of Cthulhu adventures that I wrote actually depends upon you showing the players a map and then showing you the players the map again later on. Only the map isn't the same. There's an extra street in the area of the town that wasn't there before. And you don't mention it or anything. You just show them the map, the second map, and they're like, hang on.
Mm.
Where did that street come from?
As for combat, something that throws me right out of the game is sitting there for 10 rounds doing nothing whilst people debate whether or not they want to do Eldritch Blast or not Eldritch Blast, when actually 10 times out of 10 they're going to use Eldritch Blast. So it's kind of a little bit like, that depends on your system. So if you've got Cthulhu Dark, if you engage in one-on-one combat with a player, it's a very simple mechanic, which is you roll against that person, and if they roll higher, they win. If you roll higher, you win. If you're rolling against a Lovecraftian monster, you're gonna lose. That's just the rule. The rule is you face a Lovecraftian creature, you're a weak and feeble human, there's nothing that you can do. Doesn't necessarily mean death. There are things worse than death. But the point of the combat side of things is that will be something that will be your system dictates that. And systems that are more story-based will have a very light combat situation. So if you're looking to bring a heavy combat element into a horror game, you can still have your horror elements, but be aware that it may pull some people out of the game. It, again, swings and roundabouts. Some people love combat, some people hate it. I hate combat, but it's up to you as a player.
Also, can you use the mechanics to reinforce the tone that you want, right? Like there are ways that you can roll dice that make a situation more or less tense. And if that's what you're going for is tension and fear, like look at how you can adjust the mechanics to get the effect that you want.
Yeah, I wanted to say a word on maps, which is, it's a shout out to that Gordy Murphy game. They are the Hollows of Desolation, which starts pre-game world. Like, you know, you're not playing the game yet, although you are playing the game, because the first thing you do is you make a map together as a player group with the GM. And so it's rather than the GM putting a map in front of you, it's a map you made as a group. And I found that a really nice way to build a game. Alan's asked Jesse in particular why you kind of added trophy gold to the trophy ecosystem. You kind of he says, I think I know, but I'm curious for a horse's mouth view.
Yeah, I did answer this in the chat, but I'll answer it out loud too. So part of it was selfishly because I just wanted to play all the great OSR modules, but in a system that I liked better. So I needed a system for that. And then secondly, so this again was a conversation that happened in the chat, but Trophy Dark is really like a critique of colonialism and how these people who go in and take treasures from lands that are not theirs back to their homes are not necessarily good people. And in the same way, Trophy Gold is my commentary on kind of the cycles of debt that can happen in capitalism. So I felt like I had a message to share there and wanted to do it in a way that was about play and not heavy-handed messaging. And so, yeah, that's why it exists.
That is awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I wanted to share with Paul as well that he said, A.V. Jones says, having played with Paul online last summer, I can assure him he GM'd a great Cthulhu Hack session. So there you go. You've got we've got fans in the audience. I'm just cycling through for questions. I've got so many messages. It's like insane. So I'm going through and see if I can find. Okay. So Martin's asked, if death is inevitable, do we risk turning horror into a kind of voyeurism? Is there a sort of voyeuristic pleasure in like watching horrible demises going on or experiencing them? Howard, yeah, do you want to come in?
I've written a fair amount about this sort of thing. One horror genre that is hugely popular, even though no one actually admits to liking it, is torture porn, right? People like their Saw movies. They like the Hostel and that sort of thing. I have issues, but the point is that, yeah, all right, sometimes there is a voyeurism in it, but it's more complex than that. It's like in The Wicker Man, for instance, the policeman's a jerk, right? He is a jerk, but that doesn't make it okay when it turns out that the seemingly nice sex-positive pagan villagers are in fact engaged in, as well as grooming children in slightly icky ways that anyone with safeguarding training will look at and go, I'm calling social services. They actually also are involved in murdering someone for the sake of the economy, which in 2021 is something that actually would kind of,
happened.
you know, you got to think
Yes.
about. But that's, it's inevitable. It was inevitable all along. And there is kind of a pleasure. One of the worst takes possible on The Wicker Man is to go, I back the pagans. Don't back the pagans. But it is still that thing where you're watching the guy go to his doom and you sort of know he's going to his doom, even though you don't know he's going to his doom, unless you were spoiled by it. I'm sorry if you haven't seen The Wicker Man, by the way, everyone. I've completely ruined it for you. Go watch the Nicolas Cage version because it's funny.
No.
But not the Beast. But yeah, I think the point I'm making is that, yeah, all right, there's some voyeurism involved in horror. There's some voyeurism involved in the thing. I'm talking about Nightmare on Elm Street because I saw it for the very first time only recently. And, you know, Johnny Depp's death scene is spectacular, right, in that movie. And that's not really a spoiler because you know that that the only person who's going to survive Nightmare on Elm Street is the final girl because it's a 1985 slasher movie. But the fact is, you're watching it, it's that thing where you're kind of hoping that it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You don't want it to happen, and you want it to happen, and you're waiting for it to happen, but you're really kind of going, no, don't do that. No, ow.
It's more complicated than just like a voyeurism of like enjoying a demise. Yeah.
And that's why that's why torture porn is bad, kids.
Yeah.
I also think that
I do. Sorry, I have to come in there, Howard, and say that my take is that I back the pagans in The Wicker Man, but maybe this is a discussion we'll have to take off this session, and you have to tell me why I'm wrong. I think it's because my mum let me watch it when I was 11, and that was probably a bad move, and so it's like affected me psychologically. But anyway, Kathryn.
Much like when I watched Jaws at 8 years old, and now I have a fear of lilos. So I think one of the things that, touching on kind of what you said, is bringing that back to that, it's that catharsis, it's the tension, and then once the horrible thing happens, all of that tension is released, and you just go, So, like, for example, there's a film called The Black Death, and it features Sean Bean, and if you don't think you know what's going to happen in it, you probably already have spoiled it in your head because of what happens to Sean Bean in every film. But in it, he is basically, spoilers for The Black Death, Sean Bean is pulled apart by two horses and his legs and his arms get ripped off. And all the way through the film, there's this building tension until that moment. And then it all gets released in one moment of like, and then the film drops tension again, and then they can ramp it back up to another reveal. So it's very much that losing energy. And I think it's not a bad thing in roleplay games for there to be a death for all of the characters at the end, because like we've discussed before, it gives people a bit of freedom to figure out how does this fit into the story rather than worrying about how do I just live. It makes people want to go and open the door because they're not thinking, well, if I open the door then I'm going to lose my character and not be able to have them next session. You go, okay, well, the character's going to die this session, I'm going to go open the door and see what's in there. Yeah. But the other thing is that I think there's been a bit of misconception with some of these systems. Some of these systems don't rely on death at the end necessarily. The point is that there is a bleakness, inevitability of this cosmic horror. That doesn't mean you die necessarily. It just means that what impact you have as human, especially in the Lovecraftian genre, does not impact the world as a whole. And the terrible thing is going to happen regardless of you. And you are just, a little pawn in the world. So yeah, you might not die, but certainly something horrible happens to you. And I think that gives people a level of creativity to be like, well, how do you go out, essentially, whether it be death or not death? And that's fun for players to think, do I lean into the horrible thing that happens and become a cult leader? Or do I run away from it and go and live in a hole in the woods somewhere?
Or even if it's not running away or going mad, it's just this decentering of the human as the center of the story or the center of the world. And it might not necessarily be a horrifying ending. It's just that, yeah, you've been decentered. And I think on that note, I like ending on that note. Let's decenter the human, and we'll have to end our discussion there because we're heading to 7 o'clock.